Hello, friends. Welcome back. This is our third installment of Period 8. Today we'll be looking at the Korean War and some other Cold War stuff. So we'll start with the Korean War. So Korea was divided, we talked about this in class today, on the 38th parallel. Soviet armies occupied Korean territory north of the line, and U.S. forces occupied territory to the south. On June 25th, 1950, the North Korean army actually invaded South Korea. President Truman took it right to the UN, the United Nations, and they decided that UN forces would actually step up to defend South Korea, and that these forces would be under U.S. leadership. Other nations did make up the UN forces. However, U.S. troops were in the majority. And they were led by General Douglas MacArthur, who had made a really big name for himself during World War II. So he was definitely a World War II hero, and he was just keeping up with his military prowess here in Korea. Congress supported the use of U.S. troops, but never actually declared war. This was viewed as more of a police action than anything else. The Korean War is often seen as both brilliant and terrible all at once. Looking at the Korean conflict politically, Truman's policy of containment had worked. Remember, we talked about containment being the policy that the United States kind of took under its wing for dealing with communism, and that we would contain it in the spaces that it was and not allow it to continue to grow. In this particular case, containment stopped communist aggression without allowing the conflict to develop into a world war. Justification for dramatically expanding the military, funding new jet bombers, and stationing more U.S. troops overseas. As a result of the Korean War, we see the second Red Scare. So just like the Red Scare followed World War I, after World War II here in the United States, we see a second Red Scare. Americans were scared that communist conspirators and spies had infiltrated American society, including the U.S. State Department, as well as the U.S. military. And this is something that really invoked fear into Americans because they did not want communism here. They had been told, that communism was obviously a bad thing, and they didn't want it here. We wanted democracy and the American way of life. Security and civil rights. So I mentioned this in our blog, but Truman himself in 1947 set up the Loyalty Review Board to investigate the background of more than 3 million federal employees. The Federal Review Board went on for 4 years. Thousands of officials and civil service employees lost their jobs or resigned as a result of being questioned by the Review Board. In 1940, we see the passage of the Smith Act, which made it illegal to advocate or teach the overthrowing of government by force to belong to an organization with this sort of objective. Leaders of the American Communist Party were actually jailed for advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government. Un-American activities. If you were caught doing un-American activities or viewed as doing un-American activities, this could be detrimental to your job, your way of life, your living, your home, etc. The House of Representatives set up the Un-American Activities Committee, or the HUAC, and it was reactivated in the post-war years to kind of find communists. Not only did the HUAC investigate government officials, but it also looked for communist influence in such organizations as the Boy Scouts, and the Hollywood film industry was hit really hard, believe it or not. Actors, directors, and writers were called before the committee to testify. Those who refused to testify were tried for contempt of Congress. Others were blacklisted from the industry altogether. Blacklisting was a pretty big deal. It could find you out of a job, especially during this time period. Cultural impact. Obviously, this had a chilling effect on freedom of expression. Maybe some of you have read Death of a Salesman, the book, which is a really great book, but it was under attack during this time period and viewed as anti-American. So just think movies, books, songs, etc. They could all be viewed as anti-American, and that could reflect obviously on the author, and have some pretty steep ramifications going forward. South Pacific, the movie. I want to wash that man right out of my hair. Maybe you've heard of that. Um, was viewed as a communistic assault on racial segregation. So and it's all game. Anything's game. And if anything is viewed as communist or communistic or communistic propaganda, you better watch out. Loyalty oaths were commonly required of writers and teachers as a condition of employment. The American Civil Liberties Union and other opponents of these security measures argued that the First Amendment protected the freedom of expression of unpopular political views and membership of the into political parties, including even the Communist Party. So there were people who spoke out against this, but they weren't overly successful. We see also during this time period the Rosenberg case. When Soviets tested the first atomic bomb in 1949, many Americans were convinced that they had spied and helped, and that had helped to steal the technology. If you remember correctly, we spoke about this in class, the Russians were not included in the atomic bombing situation that took place during World War I. The United States did not invite Russia, did not want Russia's input, etc. So for all Americans knew, Russia did not have this technology. However, Soviets were testing atomic bombs in 1949, and we believed that they had spied to get this information. Klaus Fuchs, who was a British scientist who had worked on the Manhattan Project, admitted that he had given A-bomb secrets to the Russians. Another FBI investigation traced another spy ring to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg of New York. They went on trial in 1951. This was seen as very controversial, and as you could probably guess, they were found guilty of treason and then were executed in 1953. At the time, civil rights groups charged that anti-communist hysteria was more responsible for the conviction and punishment of the Rosenbergs, because they essentially felt like the United States government was making an example of these people. This is also the time we see the rise of Joseph McCarthy, who was a Republican senator from Wisconsin, and he used the growing concern over communism as a platform for re-election. He wrote a wave of anti-communism feelings to help make himself one of the most powerful men in America. His power was based entirely on people's fear of danger. He would of the danger he could cause if he was accusing you of being a communist. As a result of his actions, many people lost their jobs. Many people were put in jail that weren't communists. It was just kind of a crazy time period. Okay, so we're moving on to President Eisenhower. And the Ike years range from 1952 to 1960. Here's a great quote from one of the most important Supreme Court cases of the time period, or ever, really. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate education facilities are inherently unequal. This was spoken by Earl Warren in the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas trial, which took place on May 17th, 1954. In the 1950s, have the popular image of like the show Happy Days, when the nation prospered and teens enjoyed rock and roll and everything was groovy, and we have a very nostalgic view of the 50s, and this is in some aspects correct, but it's also a very limited view of the 1950s. The 50s, of course, starts with the Korean War and this Red Scare, the wrath of McCarthyism. African Americans are still struggling for civil rights. Yet in this time period is when they step up to take a stand on civil rights. and gaining their civil rights. Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King become household names. Most Americans were enjoying I Love Lucy on the television. However, the Cold War and the threat of nuclear destruction always loomed in the background. So President Eisenhower, essentially Ike, known as Ike, personified the 1950s. Millions and millions of middle-class Americans liked his winning smile and trusted and admired the former general who successfully helped to command the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, rather. He was a household name. He was trusted, trustworthy, was super successful during the war. So people, appreciated him. He came up with many domestic policies that were often criticized, but did a lot of good for our country. He adopted a style of leadership that emphasized the delegation of authority. His cabinet was filled with successful corporate executives who gave his administration a business-like tone. He was often criticized by the press, but behind the scenes, he was really in control. This is what we call the era of modern republicanism. He was a fiscal conservative, Eisenhower was, and he wanted to balance the budget after years of deficit spending by the Democrats. Looking at you, FDR and Truman. He was a moderate on domestic issues, and he accepted most of the New Deal programs as a way of life, and even in some cases helped to extend them. Social Security was extended to 10 million more citizens. He increased the minimum wage. More access to public housing was created during this time. He consolidated welfare programs by creating the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and also helped to create the Solid Bank Program, which reduced farm production in an effort to increase farm income. He was against federal health care insurance, and he was also against federal aid to education, which is interesting because he plays a major role in an important desegregation movement that happens later on. One of the greatest legacies was the passage of the Highway Act in 1956, which helped to build 42 miles of interstate highways linking all the nation's major cities. Our highway system then becomes a model for the rest of the world, which is pretty cool. Some historians call Ike the most successful modern president when it comes to his economic policies. Under Ike, between 45 and 60, the per capita disposable income of Americans more than tripled. By the mid-50s, the average American family had twice the real income of a comparable family in the 1920s. Pretty cool. So Ike and the Cold War. A lot of Ike's attention in both his terms focused on foreign policy and various international crises that come from the Cold War. Ike was helped by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who helped to shape foreign policy. Dulles' diplomacy. Dulles felt that Truman's containment was too passive. He wanted to take more of a stand. He wanted to challenge the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. He felt that if we push communist powers to the brink of war, that they would back down because of American nuclear superiority. And we call this brinkmanship. Bring them right to the brink and see, it's like playing chicken, see who's going to collapse first. In the end, Ike prevented Dulles from carrying his ideas to the extreme. Dulles believed in massive retaliation. He wanted to place greater reliance on nuclear weapons and air power and spend less on conventional forces. In 1953, we developed the hydrogen bomb, which was more powerful than that of the A-bomb. The Soviets quickly are able to catch up with this technology. Massive retaliation, therefore, would look more like mutual extinction. There's a lot of stuff going on around the world at this time, and some Americans are worried that communism was going to get a stronghold in some of these areas. I think we'll stop here, and we'll talk about unrest in third world nations next time I see you. Adios.